Hey guys, tonight we will unveil the horrifying final days of Philip II, the king who once ruled half the known world, now fighting the most brutal battle of all, the merciless decay of his own body. On the cold stones of Escorial, we will step through silent doors, where the breath of power slowly turns into the moans of rotting flesh, and swarms of maggots attack like invisible adversaries, reminding us that no one can conquer the laws of nature. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Comment below and let me know where you are watching from and what the local time is right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Philip II was born on the 15th of October, in the year 1530 in Valladolid, as the only surviving son of Emperor Charles V and Empress Isabella of Portugal. His lineage combined the Habsburg and Avis dynasties through his father and mother, laying the foundation for a powerful alliance between Spain and Portugal that extended its influence across Europe and into the New World. His paternal grandfather was Emperor Maximilian I, and his maternal grandfather was King Manuel I of Portugal. Doubling the weight of expectation on Philip's shoulders from an early age, Philip's childhood was shaped within the strict confines of his father's court at Charles's palace. From a young age, he studied classical Roman texts, Catholic theology, and the art of war under tutors, personally chosen by the emperor. His first marriage at 17 was a political union with Maria Manuela of Portugal, the granddaughter of King Manuel I. Though their bond was close, Maria Manuela died shortly after giving birth to their only child, a daughter named Elizabeth, leaving Philip as both grieving widower and father to an infant princess. At 14, Philip was crowned in Madrid, inheriting the throne his father left behind. He entered his reign with unwavering determination over the next 47 years. He tirelessly expanded his vast empire, known as the king on whom the sun never set. Philip extended his dominion through campaigns in the Netherlands, support for anti-Ottoman efforts in North Africa, and the establishment of maritime routes to the Far East, where he lent his name to the Philippine Islands. Under his rule, Spain emerged as the foremost naval and economic superpower of its age. Philip's matrimonial life spanned 4 successive marriages, first to Maria Manuela, then to Elizabeth of Valois, who bore him 2 children, Carlos and Isabella, next to Louise de Valois, who bore no issue, and finally to Anna of Austria, who gave him 4 more children, including Maria Theresia. Although he fathered 9 legitimate children in total, only 3 Carlos, Isabella, and Maria Theresia survived to adulthood. His heir, Prince Carlos, died before him, compelling Philip to plan for succession through his grandson, who would become Philip III. In his final years, Philip endured multiple chronic ailments, gout, since his youth, debilitating arthritis that restricted his movement, and widespread abscesses coupled with high fever. At the age of 71, he was confined to the palace he himself had built, El Escorial, serving as both royal residence and monastery. After months of stupor and agony, Philip died on the morning of the 13th of September in the year 1598, his body ravaged by relentless decay. His remains were interred in the royal pantheon at El Escorial beside his parents and deceased wives. Philip II's career and life are etched deeply into history through his grand architectural legacy, El Escorial, and his unshakable devotion to Catholicism. He is remembered as a majestic yet human sovereign, driven by the ambition to forge an invincible monarchy, even as he endured profound personal tragedies. The tale of a king who once ruled half the globe, only to succumb to the immutable laws of nature, endures as an everlasting lesson on the limits of power and the fragile essence of life. Starting in the summer of 1598, Philip II, the most formidable monarch in Europe, entered the final gambit of his life, against an adversary he could neither threaten nor vanquish, his own decaying flesh. Son of Emperor Charles V, he had forged a global empire. Making the boast that the sun never set on his dominions, as champion of Catholic orthodoxy during the Counter-Reformation, he dispatched the Invincible Armada against England and financed ruthless campaigns to eradicate Protestant heresy across the continent. Yet all these wars, naval engagements, and political intrigues would pale beside the mortal contest unfolding in his marble bedchamber. For 6 relentless decades, Philip had confronted every challenge with unwavering resolve, yet age and chronic illness had begun to erode his once indomitable constitution. Gout, afflicting him since his early 30s, twisted his knees, wrists, and fingers into crippling pain. By 1591, he relied upon a wheelchair to navigate the halls of Escorial. Still, his legendary work ethic persisted. Even from his chair, he meticulously reviewed every state document, every decree and dispatch marked by his decisive hand, for a single word could seal the fate of thousands under his rule. Then came June of 1598, when his body finally rebelled beyond endurance. A fever of alarming intensity took hold, and festering abscesses erupted on his right knee and hand. Royal physicians, constrained by the era's medical dogma, resorted to cupping and bloodletting practices meant to rebalance the body's humours, but, in truth, only served to spread the putrid infection. The miasma of his wounds resisted all attempts at healing, and he drifted into delirium, weakened to the point where only his head and left arm could respond to his commands. Within the sealed confines of the royal chamber, once the seat of imperial majesty, Philip found himself utterly dependent upon his courtiers and guards for the simplest of tasks. He required assistance to swallow his broth, to relieve himself, to have his bedding changed. The rituals of courtly etiquette, once so rigid and exacting, dissolved into horror as the bedclothes grew sodden with sweat and weeping pus. The very stones of Escorial, chilled by the mountain night air, reverberated with the quiet anguish of a sovereign laid low. Each morning, servants crept in to tend his wounds, which refused to close. They cleaned away the foul discharge, only to uncover fresh torrents of infected fluid. The stench of decay thickened the air so severely that attendants shielded their faces with perfumed cloths as they approached his bedside. Yet Philip, painfully lucid, in moments between fever dreams, forbade them from opening the windows, not for his comfort, but to spare the outside world the affront of his foul odour. As the days wore on, the king's once imperious frame lay prostrate, every movement eliciting cries of agony that echoed through the corridors. His body had become a battleground, each abscess a war zone teeming with invisible assailants. Even the faithful priests who came to administer last rites found themselves recoiling at the sight of skin stretched taut over rotting tissue, as though the very membrane of his flesh could not withstand the siege any longer. Despite his anguish, Philip's mind remained a fortress of clarity, arguably his cruelest torment. He was keenly aware of every indignity, of every moment spent entombed in his own suffering. On occasion, he would gather the strength to speak of matters of state, directing his son and heir in the affairs of empire, as though he refused to relinquish the mantle of kingship, even as his body betrayed him. One can imagine the scene: a once commanding sovereign, his voice faint but resolute, issuing orders while his limbs lay helpless. Trust placed in the hands of those he once summoned at will. By the height of summer, the infection had spread beyond his limbs and into his torso. He became unable even to shift his position without excruciating pain. So his attendants devised crude slings and cushions to ease his agony. Yet these only offered marginal relief. The thick bedding became a breeding ground for vermin. Rumours whispered that lice and maggots had found refuge in the folds of his linens. Drawn by the damp warmth and the rich supply of festering tissue, whether these tales were literal or born of morbid imagination, they spoke to the magnitude of his plight. Throughout it all, the courtiers maintained their vigil, torn between duty and revulsion. Some kept watch by his side for hours, offering cold water or a prayer. Others lingered at the threshold, glancing with dread at the grid of wooden beams overhead, as if the architecture itself were collapsing under the weight of its master's torment. No longer did they bow with measured grace. Instead, they tiptoed, as if afraid to disturb the hush of suffering that now defined the palace. And so, the summer wore on, each sunrise heralding another day of prolonged suffering. Philip, once the architect of campaigns that shaped the course of European history, now lay at the mercy of his own flesh. No cannonade could shake him. No envoy could comfort him. In his final act as king, he embodied the immutable truth that no title, no army, no empire could shield a man from the inexorable decay that awaits all living flesh. This chapter of his life, played out behind the closed doors of El Escorial, stands as a testament to the ultimate vulnerability of power. It is a grim reminder that the mightiest monarch can be undone not by armies or conspirators, but by the silent, creeping hand of mortality itself. A lesson as sobering now as it was in the summer of 1598, when the July sun blazed at its fiercest. Philip's torment reached new heights. Abscesses, once confined to his knee and hand, now spread across his chest, groin, and down both legs, each one a festering crater, emitting a stench so vile that courtiers dared not enter the corridors without pressing scented cloths to their faces. The king, still lucid through his agony, commanded the windows be sealed, not to keep warmth in, but to prevent the foul odours of gangrene from offending those beyond his chamber walls, immobilized entirely by his wounds. Philip lay drenched in a sheen of sweat. The summer heat, relentless and unforgiving, soaked the linens faster than servants could replace them, creating a damp, rotting nest upon which parasites thrived. In early August, an invasion of lice began. They swarmed his body in cloud-like masses, burrowing into folds of skin and feasting on the necrotic tissue beneath. Servants, their hearts heavy with pity, would gather handfuls of the pests by hand, only to find, hours later, new swarms crawling back as if summoned by the scent of decay itself. But even these relentless lice were mere prelude to a yet more gruesome affliction. Maggots. Maggots of flies that had slipped through the palace's well-guarded gates took up residence in his open sores. Each morning, silver trays, once reserved for the finest delicacies, were filled with writhing larvae, collected in sombre ritual by the king's attendants. By midday, the trays would overflow anew, as the maggots burrowed deeper into his flesh, carving tunnels through the rotted flesh like excavators in a tomb of living stone. Amid this physical horror, Philip clung to his unwavering faith. He requested that daily mass be held at his bedside. The soft rustle of priests' vestments, a fragile balm against the din of his suffering. He asked for scripture readings, murmuring prayers between laboured breaths, seeking solace in each familiar verse. In moments of excruciating pain, he would grasp the crucifix his father had once held, pressing its cool metal into his palm and drawing strength from its weight. Despite his frailty, the king's mind remained a bastion of clarity. On occasion, he summoned his son, the future Philip III, to his side. In hushed tones that belied his weakening voice, he discussed the governance of Spain, the fate of the Netherlands, and the succession of territories in the New World. It was a cruel testament to his brilliance that even as his body fell apart, his intellect carried the burdens of state without hesitation or forgetfulness. Courtiers who witnessed these councils often spoke in hushed awe of his composure. Here lay the man who had commanded fleets and armies, now confined to a single bed by forces he could neither see nor summon. Yet he spoke as though seated upon his throne, issuing decrees, weighing counsel, and lamenting the shortcomings of ministers who would never again earn his favour. Each word, delivered between sharp gasps of pain, served as a reminder of the indomitable will that had steered an empire. As the weeks wore on, the king's body became a landscape of infections. Pressure sores bloomed upon his hips and lower back, exposing bone and muscle in grotesque display. He could no longer shift his weight without agony that seemed to rend him from within. Beneath the closed curtains of his chamber, the once mighty sovereign fought a silent war against time and decay. His bedchamber transformed into a theatre of living death. And yet, in the depths of his ordeal, there lingered a thread of humanity. When a servant wept at the sight of his bleeding wounds, Philip would whisper words of comfort, urging them to carry on their duties without fear. When a priest hesitated to administer the Eucharist, repulsed by the sight of maggot-ridden flesh, the king would reassure him, faith demands perseverance amid the most harrowing trials. In these fleeting moments of compassion, even the most hardened attendants found glimmers of the man who had once ruled their lives with unyielding authority. Thus, the summer of 1598 unfurled its sweltering days and nights, each marked by the slow, relentless progression of Philip's afflictions. As he lay entombed within the marble walls of Escorial, both his body and spirit endured the most profound test. It was a final chapter of agony and dignity, a testament to a life spent in the service of power, faith, and empire, a chapter that, though filled with unspeakable horror, he would echo through history as the ultimate reckoning of mortality. At the beginning of September, the relentless siege on Philip's body took an even more harrowing turn. Pressure ulcers, sores born of his unyielding immobility, erupted across his hips and lower back. The constant dampness of sweat and seepage of blood left his skin macerated, worn thin until the bleached white of bone peered through. Court chronicles solemnly record that one such ulcer on his right hip grew to the size of a clenched fist, producing each day enough necrotic matter to fill 2 silver basins. These were no mere sores, but a ghastly ecosystem flies hurried in to lay their eggs. Maggots crawled from the rotted flesh, lice clustered in the folds of his bedding. Whenever servants attempted to shift his position or change the sodden sheets, Philip's cries of anguish echoed through the palace corridors. Once the master of life and death, he who had ordered traitors' heads to roll, he now beseeched his attendants for the slightest bit of mercy. The clarity of his mind remained undiminished, yet his dignity was shredded by the scurrying insects that landed on his open wounds, crawling into his nostrils, mouth, and ears, defying any attempt at repulsion. In firm adherence to the prevailing theory of the 4 humours, the royal physicians turned to arsenic and mercury as salves, torrents of toxic ointment to balance his vital spirits. Instead of healing, these caustic substances burned the fragile tissue further, accelerating the decay. Bloodletting, still thought to purge fever, drained what little strength remained in the king's battered frame. His diet dwindled to thin broth, watery wine, and soft crumbs of stale bread, if he could manage to swallow them between laboured breaths. Edema soon accompanied the festering wounds. His legs ballooned from renal failure. The fluid overflowed into his abdomen, stretching taut the flayed skin around his midsection. The constant pressure aggravated the existing ulcers, deepening each wound until muscle and tendon lay exposed. His liver and heart, straining under the accumulated poisons of infection and treatment, began to falter. Court records note irregular pulsations, palpitations echoing like distant drums, signalling the onset of sepsis. Philip's breathing grew erratic, a slow, rattling rasp as his lungs filled with fluid. Each inhale required the effort of a condemned man drawing himself to the gallows. He gripped the arms of his bed, knuckles whitening, and drew in air as though the very act might tear him apart. Each exhalation was accompanied by the sickly odour of decay dissolving his breath. Despite the excruciating physical torment, Philip summoned the strength to perform small acts of grace. When a surgeon paused in sorrow at the sight of fresh maggots in a cavity, the king whispered words of forgiveness, urging him to proceed. When his confessor hesitated, overcome by revulsion, Philip reminded him gently that Christ had suffered wounds greater still. These moments revealed the austere nobility of a man who, though ravaged beyond recognition, could still summon compassion for those who cared for him. As the days of September slipped by, the palace seemed suspended between life and death. The once vibrant halls of Escorial fell silent, broken only by the drip of medicinal mixtures and the muted shuffle of attendants. News of the king's plight reached the highest councils of Europe, yet none dared presume upon his final hours. Even his most audacious enemies spoke in hushed tones of the sovereign reduced to such a state. On occasion, Philip's consciousness would drift into fevered dreams. He would recall triumphant victories, the roar of cannon across the Channel, and the proud sight of his armada under full sail. Then the dream would shift, and he would find himself alone in a winding corridor, the stones slick with dark patches that pulsed like living wounds. He would call out, and only his own echo would answer, reminding him of the solitude imposed by his mortal frailty. In moments of lucidity, he continued to direct affairs of state through whispered admonitions. He inquired after the welfare of distant provinces, questioned the readiness of garrisons, and bade his ministers to remember the eternal promise of Catholic unity. His words, though faint, bore the same weight they had always carried. Each utterance could alter the fate of kingdoms. It was a paradox too cruel to ignore the greatest conqueror of his age, now helpless and reliant on human kindness. Finally, as autumn began its quiet approach, Philip's body teetered on the edge of collapse. The combination of systemic infection, toxic treatments, and brutal bodily ravaging formed an unstoppable tide. His organs, overwhelmed, ceased to function in unison. His kidneys no longer filtered the poisons. His heart struggled against the encroaching cold of impending death. The doctors, their remedies exhausted, could only hold vigil at his bedside, offering prayers rather than cures. Each breath grew more laboured, the rasping wind of mortality echoing through the silent chamber. His attendants gathered close, faces shadowed by grief, unwilling to leave their sovereign in his final moments. The king, ever mindful of decorum, attempted a faint smile, an echo of his former majesty, and thanked them for their service. And so, in the late hours of a September night, Philip II exhaled his last. It was a breath that carried away the echo of empire, leaving behind a hushed testament. Even the mightiest monarch can be unravelled by the relentless advance of decay. In that final moment, the bedchamber of Escorial bore witness to the universal truth that no crown, no army, and no ambition can defy the immutable laws of flesh and bone, a truth that would linger in history's memory long after the candles burned out. By mid-September, the end had become unmistakably near. Philip summoned his children and grandchildren to his bedside, his voice barely more than a whisper. Remember that glory is fleeting, and power but a fleeting shadow. Among those who bowed by his side was his son and heir, the future Philip III, who was reported to have left the chamber more than once, overcome by the sight of his father's ravaged form and the stench of decay that hung in the air like a suffocating shroud. On the morning of the 13th of September, in the year 1598, after receiving the last sacraments and having a silver cross placed upon his chest, Philip II closed his eyes forever. The sovereign of an empire upon which the sun never set had finally been conquered, not by armies nor enemies, but by the smallest of creatures, the relentless agents of putrefaction that burrowed into his flesh and devoured him from within. What followed was a macabre trial. Even death itself had not prepared for the embalming. The royal embalmers, accustomed to preserving the corpses of nobles with spices and oils, found themselves battling a body far too decomposed. His skin, paper-thin over bone, cracked and fell away upon touch. The scent of rotting flesh was more intense than any embalming chamber could contain. They worked feverishly, packing the cavities with fragrant incense, cloves, cinnamon, and generous dashes of arsenic and mercury to delay the inevitable collapse of tissue. Yet each carefully applied layer of ointment and each handful of perfumed dust provided only a few hours of respite before the body began to break down anew. In acknowledgement of this dire state, the funeral rites were drastically abbreviated. Gone were the days of elaborate processions and weeks of public mourning. Instead, the royal cortege moved with solemn speed. Philip's remains were carried, draped in black velvet, along the cold stone corridors of Escorial, directly to the royal crypt beneath the basilica. There, alongside his forebears, his father Charles V, his mother Isabella of Portugal, and his many departed consorts, the last vestiges of his earthly glory were interred in the cool darkness of the tomb. News of the king's ghastly demise spread like wildfire across Europe. In Protestant England and the United Provinces of the Netherlands, the common folk regarded the fate of Philip II as divine retribution for his years of persecution of the Reformed faith. Pamphlets crudely printed and crudely illustrated depicted his body in various stages of putrefaction, each new edition more sensational than the last. Town criers read aloud tales of his suffering in marketplaces, accompanied by mock processions that carried effigies of his decomposing form. Even Queen Elizabeth I, his longtime rival, is said to have remarked upon hearing the details, "We must not laugh at the torments of princes, for they remind us all of the limits of our own mortal state." Despite the bitter rivalry and political machinations that had defined her relationship with Philip, she recognized in his demise a universal lesson that all men, whether crowned or common, must face the same end. In Catholic territories, all official accounts of his passing were carefully censored. The more disturbing excerpts, the descriptions of maggots writhing beneath his skin, or the lice that feasted upon his wounds, were omitted entirely. Instead, state-sanctioned versions emphasized his piety, his acceptance of the sacraments, and his concern for the continuity of the Spanish crown. Messages of condolence poured in from European courts, each expressing regret that so great a monarch had departed, but none daring to dwell publicly on the nature of his final illness. In Madrid, the populace was ordered to observe 3 days of solemn prayer. Churches tolled their bells at dawn, noon, and dusk, while masses were offered for the repose of his soul. Yet behind closed doors, the scent of spices still lingered in the streets, residue from the embalming that had seeped from the tomb, mingling with the incense of mourning. And though the official narrative cast Philip as a paragon of virtue, ordinary citizens shared hushed whispers of the true horror they imagined. Some years later, in the quiet corners of scholarly debate, physicians and historians revisited these accounts. The consensus emerged that Philip had likely suffered from a combination of advanced arthritis, diabetes, and systemic infection, perhaps even a staphylococcal sepsis, compounded by the rudimentary and often harmful treatments of his day. Yet for the common folk, such medical explanations did little to dispel the enduring image of a once mighty king reduced to a feast for vermin. In the centuries that followed, the tale of Philip II's demise would inspire cautionary works of art, literature, and theology. Painters of the Baroque period incorporated subtle skull motifs and rotting fruit into still-life compositions, echoing the impermanence of earthly grandeur. Poets penned elegies that juxtaposed empire and mortality, reminding readers that the greatness of man is only as lasting as the flesh that carries his soul. And in the hushed hush of Escorial's corridors, weary pilgrims would still pause before the royal crypt, sensing somewhere in the silent stone the fading echo of a king's final breath. Thus concluded the last act of Philip II's life, a spectacle of suffering that transcended politics, faith, and power, leaving behind a legacy of awe, and a warning that no crown can shield a man from the final decay to which all living beings are subject. The Spanish populace received news of Philip's passing with a tone of reverent solemnity. Official bulletins spoke of a glorious exit, emphasizing the king's steadfast faith and unwavering dignity even in the face of mortal frailty. Sermons and orations framed his final days as a crucible of piety. A monarch who had defended the true faith now endured his last trial with the same devout composure. Church bells tolled across the kingdom, and clergy reminded the faithful that Philip's sufferings had been offered up like a martyr's for the good of Spain and Christendom. Yet modern historians and medical scholars have since pieced together a more clinical portrait of his decline. They conclude that Philip likely endured chronic gout from his early adulthood, which progressed into a form of rheumatoid arthritis, sapping his mobility and confining him to a wheelchair. A combination of unchecked diabetes, evidenced by his persistent thirst and swelling extremities and declining kidney function, further compromised his immune defenses. Initially, a small abscess may have served as an entry point for Staphylococcus bacteria, which then spread unchecked through his system. Prolonged immobility and the oppressive summer heat led to severe pressure ulcers that opened canals into his flesh, providing maggots a gateway into the very core of his decaying tissue. In the absence of antibiotics or antiseptics, these infections metastasized, culminating in full-blown sepsis and organ failure. Philip's demise thus stands as a harsh reminder that absolute authority, however formidable, is powerless before the immutable laws of life and death. Here was a ruler whose word once commanded fleets and armies, who had styled himself as God's chosen instrument on earth, now unable to command even the simplest forces of nature, the flies, the lice, and the bacteria that thrived in his wounds. No edict could banish them, no army could crush them. In his final hours, the great king on whom the sun never set was humbled by the smallest creatures, his flesh reduced to a theatre of decay. This episode also marked the beginning of a long, slow decline for Spain's global dominance. With Philip II gone, his successor and son Philip III ascended the throne. Lacking his father's iron will, insight, and administrative rigour, the new king proved ill-equipped to manage the sprawling empire. He delegated authority to royal favourites, neglected fiscal reforms, and allowed provincial unrest to fester in the Low Countries. Over the ensuing decades, Spain would squander territories in Europe and the Americas, its treasury drained by costly wars and ineffective governance. The maggots that had infested Philip's body became, in a sense, prophetic symbols of internal rot within the imperial structure itself. Today, visitors to El Escorial encounter a carefully curated narrative of Philip's final days. Museum plaques and guided tours focus on his devout reception of the sacraments, the solemn rites of his state funeral, and the splendor of his mausoleum's architecture. The macabre realities of his putrefaction are glossed over, deemed too gruesome for polite conversation. Instead, one hears tales of his relentless work ethic, how he would inspect documents even as he lay on his deathbed, and of his last blessing to the nation. The more sensational details of a living feast for vermin are relegated to whispered footnotes or omitted entirely. Yet beneath the polished veneer of official memory, the spectre of that final, insect-plagued agony lingers. In the quiet of the basilica, where the light filters through stained glass onto the marble tombs, it is impossible not to sense the paradox at the heart of El Escorial, a monumental tribute to power and faith, built by a man who ultimately surrendered to the frailty of flesh. The grandeur of the cloisters and the library stands in stark contrast to the knowledge that this very site witnessed the most intimate and horrific undoing of the king's body. For some visitors, this tension is the true draw of El Escorial. They come seeking the story untold by the official guides, the grim lesson that no vault, however opulent, can shelter a corpse from the ravages of decay. Historians, medical students, and even the casually curious pore over archival accounts, searching for the unvarnished truth. that in death, all are equal, emperor and commoner alike, become food for worms. Thus does Philip II's legacy endure, both in the stalwart stones of his memorial and in the unsettling reminder it offers that power, however absolute, cannot conquer the natural course of life, the conjugation of faith and fate, of empire and entropy, continues to resonate through the corridors of El Escorial. The sight of his sepulchre calls to mind the cruel democracy of death, where everybody, no matter how lavishly draped or ceremoniously interred, ultimately yields to the same silent, inexorable process of decay. In this sombre truth lies the enduring echo of a ruler's final days, a cautionary tale that still whispers in the stillness of Spain's royal crypt. After Philip II's spirit had departed his ravaged body, the task of preparing his remains for the tomb became an unprecedented ordeal. Traditional embalming methods, soaking the corpse in salt, infusing it with aromatic spices and resins, proved woefully inadequate against the advanced decay. His flesh, already softened and rotting, caused coffins to splinter upon contact, while the stench of decomposition overwhelmed the embalming chamber. According to court annals, the royal embalmers resorted to staggering amounts of frankincense, cloves, cinnamon, and perfumed oils to mask the odour, along with repeated spritzes of arsenic and preservative compounds to halt the spread of putrefaction. Yet these desperate measures only preserved the semblance of his form for a matter of hours before collapse resumed. As a result, the funeral rites had to be drastically condensed. The full ceremonial procession was abandoned in favour of a swift interment. Philip's lead-lined coffin was carried directly to the subterranean pantheon of El Escorial, placed beside his forebears and consorts in silent haste, rather than the grand public spectacle typically afforded to kings. News of this macabre crisis spread across Europe with startling speed. In Protestant England and the Dutch Republic, lands that had long chafed under Philip's campaigns against heresy, the gruesome details of his demise were received with quiet, almost schadenfreude-fueled satisfaction. Pamphlets bearing crude woodcuts portrayed the king's bloated, lesion-covered corpse, besieged by maggots and flies, serving as scornful tokens of divine retribution against the persecutor of the Reformed faith. Town criers in Amsterdam and London read these lurid pamphlets aloud in marketplaces, the macabre imagery printed in lurid reds and blacks to emphasize the moral of the storyteller's tale that tyranny invites decay. Even Queen Elizabeth I is said to have advised her courtiers, "Let us not mock the sufferings of princes, for in such spectacles we see our own fate mirrored." Meanwhile, in staunchly Catholic Spain and throughout the territories loyal to the Holy See, the monarchy and the church collaborated to spin a different narrative. Official communiques lauded Philip's final ordeal as a testament to his unwavering piety and virtue. References to maggots and fetid wounds were carefully excised from public records, replaced by accounts of his serene reception of the last rites and the solemn singing of requiem masses in chapels bathed in candlelight. In painted portraits commemorating his death, Philip is shown kneeling before an altar, unblemished and bathed in ethereal light, rather than the ravaged sovereign who had lain in agony mere days before. From a medical perspective, modern scholars have re-examined the king's symptoms and treatments to reconstruct the pathology of his final illness. It is now believed that Philip suffered from long-standing gout that, over decades, evolved into a severe form of rheumatoid arthritis, each joint becoming more swollen and deformed with every passing year. Complicating matters was untreated diabetes, as suggested by reports of his insatiable thirst and the alarming oedema in his legs and abdomen. His kidneys, taxed by the metabolic chaos of both diabetes and the toxic treatments of the day, began to fail. What likely began as a single abscess, perhaps from a minor skin wound, provided an entry point for Staphylococcus aureus, which multiplied and ultimately invaded his bloodstream, causing full-blown septicemia. The oppressive summer heat of El Escorial only accelerated the breeding of flies, which deposited eggs in the open ulcers, The resulting maggots thrived on the necrotic tissue, turning his wounds into living tombs. Bloodletting, though intended to reduce fever, further weakened his body. While applications of arsenic and mercury eroded tissue integrity, driving deeper necrosis rather than halting it. Politically, Philip's death marked the beginning of a gradual decline for the once mighty Spanish Empire. His heir, Philip III, lacked the iron discipline and administrative acumen of his father, haunted perhaps by the memory of his father's grotesque final days. The younger monarch retreated from hands-on governance, entrusting power to royal favourites and courtly factions. This abdication of responsibility coincided with costly military setbacks. The Dutch revolted with renewed vigour. Spain faltered in its attempt to subjugate England, and the Italian states gradually slipped from Castilian influence. The wealth that once streamed in from the Americas dwindled under poor financial management and endless warfare, leaving the empire fractured and vulnerable by the mid-17th century. Today, when travellers roam the hallowed halls of El Escorial, they are regaled with a far gentler version of Philip's passing. Tour guides speak lovingly of his devotion to Catholic ritual and his austere final prayers. They marvel at the architectural majesty of the basilica, the precision of its marble colonnades, and the vast library of priceless manuscripts, all tangible legacies of his reign. The grotesque details of rotting flesh, maggot infestations, and fetid stench are deftly sidestepped, relegated to whispered curiosities rather than centre stage. Yet beneath the polished narration, the spectre of his horrific demise lingers in the visitor's mind. One might, in a quiet moment, ponder the cruel irony, this grand edifice, built to eternalize his power and faith, also witnessed the sovereign's ultimate humiliation at the hands of decay. The lineage of Habsburg pride, his claim to divine right, all yielded to the impartial rule of biology. In this way, the corridors of El Escorial serve as a solemn reminder. No human achievement, no matter how grand, can escape the inexorable cycle of life and death. Even emperors, with their crowns of gold and armies at their command, must one day become sustenance for the very creatures they once deemed beneath them. This, perhaps, remains the most enduring echo of Philip II's legend, that in the vast tapestry of history, the triumphs of power are perpetually shadowed by the inevitability of decay. Philip II's passing transcended mere personal tragedy. It transformed into a potent cultural symbol of the brutal will to endure, and the inescapable frailty of the human body before nature's indifferent might. The haunting spectacle of a monarch once hailed as semi-divine, reduced to a feast for flies and maggots, became an enduring motif in Baroque art. Where the vanitas theme reached its zenith, still life painters such as Peter Claesch and Philippe de Champagne began to populate their canvases with decaying fruit, wilting flowers, cracked crystal, skulls, and dragonfly corpses. Each element a memento mori, reminding viewers that earthly glory and wealth are but fleeting illusions. In the hushed salons of the Enlightenment, philosophers seized upon Philip's grim end to illustrate the universal equality of mortality. Montesquieu, in his writings on the spirit of the laws, referenced the king's horrific demise as evidence that no despot could escape the natural order. Voltaire echoed this sentiment in his critiques of absolutism, using Philip's fate as a cautionary tale against unchecked authority. Their eloquent orations and essays argued that individual liberty and the inviolability of the person should replace the old doctrine of divine right. It was in this crucible of thought that the social contract theories of Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau gained traction, advocating for governance rooted in popular consent rather than hereditary privilege. Philip II's legacy did not fade into oblivion, but was later resurrected by 19th century historians keen to reassess his reign. William H. Prescott, in his seminal work Philip II and the Spanish Monarchy, devoted extensive chapters to the king's final illness and agonizing death, yet balanced these grim details with an appreciation for the architectural masterpiece he left behind El Escorial. Prescott's vivid descriptions helped cement Philip's reputation as a complex figure, both a devout Catholic champion and a tragic patient undone by disease. In the 20th and 21st centuries, archaeologists and forensic researchers have taken this inquiry further, exhuming skeletal remains and analyzing bone and dental samples to verify signs of rheumatoid arthritis, diabetes, and systemic infection. Their findings have largely corroborated contemporary accounts, affirming that Philip's ailments were indeed a lethal combination of chronic conditions aggravated by medieval medical treatments. Today, El Escorial stands not only as a triumph of Renaissance and Counter-Reformation architecture, but also as a pilgrimage site for those drawn to its dark narrative. Guided mystery and macabre tours, wind visitors through dimly lit chambers, recounting the king's final days with a hushed, almost reverent horror. Tales of maggots creeping through the stone grooves, of Vesper services held amid the scent of incense and decay, send shivers down the spines of even the most seasoned travellers. Many confess to feeling the echo of Philip's last cries carried on the mountain wind, as though the marble walls themselves retain the lament of a fallen emperor. In popular culture, Philip II's ordeal continues to fascinate. Documentaries such as El Escorial on the History Channel reconstruct his final hours with dramatic reenactments, while historical novels like The Rotten King delve into his inner turmoil, portraying him as a tragic hero, undone by both flesh and fate. Video games set in 16th century Europe occasionally allow players to encounter rumors of his living tomb, complete with pestilent swarms, an interactive reminder that no amount of power can repel the natural course of decay. From his architectural legacy to the philosophical debates he inspired, from forensic science to immersive tourism and artistic homage, the gruesome death of Philip II remains a catalyst for reflection on ambition, authority, and the vulnerability of the human form. He who once commanded the wealth of 2 continents and the fiercest armies of Christendom is perhaps most memorably known for the way his reign ended, a protracted nightmare of corruption and consumption. The stark lesson endures for every generation, no matter how high one stands. No armor of might or cloak of prestige can shield a body from the final eclipse of death. In this universal truth lies the enduring resonance of Philip's story, an eternal testament to the fragility that binds all mortal beings, from emperor to peasant, in the common fate of returning to dust. According to medical historians, Philip II may represent one of the earliest documented cases of gangrene arising from a confluence of chronic ailments. His decades-long battle with gout had evolved into a severe form of rheumatoid arthritis, sapping his mobility and leaving joints inflamed and immobilized. Compounding this was undiagnosed diabetes and progressive kidney failure, both of which undermined his immune defenses. Into this compromised system crept Staphylococcus aureus, likely entering through a small abscess that then burgeoned into a festering wound. With Philip confined to his bed for weeks, the constant pressure on bony prominences gave rise to devastating pressure ulcers that extended down to the bone itself. In the humid, stifling environment of his royal mattress, flies and lice descended in droves, while maggots proliferated in the necrotic tissue, feeding on flesh that could no longer sustain life. Contemporary medical records, especially those of royal physician Andres Zamudio de Alfaro, provide ghastly detail. He describes ulcers as large as a clenched fist, exuding foul-smelling discharge and brimming with writhing maggots. The germ theory of disease lay centuries in the future, so the treatments of the time bloodletting, cupping, and the application of arsenic and mercury ointments were intended to restore balance to the body's humours. In practice, these measures only exacerbated tissue destruction and weakened the king further. Under the relentless regimen of ventosas and leeches, Philip endured weeks of alternating delirium and lucidity, each moment of awareness, a fresh torment amidst the fog of fever. Spiritually, the king leaned heavily on his devout Catholic faith. He insisted upon daily masses at his bedside, the scent of incense blending so intimately with the stench of decay that attendants could scarcely discern one from the other. Servants recalled the solemn cadence of liturgical prayers, mingled with the faint, unceasing buzz of flies. Philip himself is said to have murmured, "O Lord, my sins are far heavier than the afflictions I now endure. Yet grant me the strength of faith to accept your will." These words reveal a profound humility and a reliance on divine mercy, at a time when his body was literally falling apart. In Madrid, the news of the king's plight cast a pall of fear and fascination over both the court and the capital. The royal family imposed strict boundaries around El Escorial during the funeral rites, barring any official from approaching the coffin lest they be overcome by the overpowering miasma. Meanwhile, the Habsburg Council pressed Philip III to ascend the throne without delay, anxious to avert any political vacuum that might embolden rival powers or spark civil unrest. The sombre transition was thus expedited. Though it came at the cost of formal pomp and ceremony, culturally, Philip's harrowing demise inspired a macabre strand of popular observance in Spain. During All Saints' Day, villagers and townsfolk recreated scenes from his last days, erecting makeshift stages where actors portrayed attendants scraping maggots from his wounds. These vivid reenactments, part ritual and part spectacle, served both as memorial and as warning no mortal, however exalted, can evade the decay inherent to flesh. Independent filmmakers have since revived this tradition online, producing short CGI-driven series that chronicle the king's final week. These dark vignettes have attracted millions of views, their hypnotic depiction of suffering echoing the same blend of horror and reverence that marked the original performances. On a broader artistic level, Philip II's ordeal solidified the memento mori motif across literature and visual arts from the 17th century onward. Writers and painters inserted skulls, wilted roses, cracked hourglasses, and decaying fruit into their work. Each symbol, a universal prompt, remember that you must die. This aesthetic permeated Baroque, still lifes, and later Romantic-era meditations, reminding viewers and readers alike that all worldly grandeur is transient. Thus, the king's physical collapse came to embody an ethical imperative to live with the awareness that power and beauty will inevitably succumb to time. Ultimately, the story of Philip II transcends its historical confines, illuminating debates in politics, morality, medicine, and culture. It underscores the paradox that a man crowned by divine right and commanding vast armies could be undone by microscopic invaders and his own deteriorating physiology. His narrative warns modern audiences that technological and medical advances, however impressive, cannot fully conquer the fundamental vulnerabilities of living tissue. The image of a once mighty emperor, reduced to food for maggots, remains a stark admonition against hubris, and an enduring testament to the egalitarian finality of death. In that sense, Philip's fate continues to resonate as a powerful, somber lesson. No armor of prestige, no fortress of stone, no mandate of heaven can shield a human body from its ultimate dissolution. His legacy lingers not only in the vaulted crypts of El Escorial, but in every Vanitas painting, every contemplative memoir, and every whispered retelling of a monarch's last breath, a breath that reminds us all of our shared mortality and the unyielding laws that govern both kings and commoners alike. Modern archaeological investigations at the royal pantheon of El Escorial have peeled back yet another layer of Philip II's grim demise. In a series of careful exhumations, experts have sampled bone and dental remains from the king's tomb, seeking traces of ancient pathogens in preserved DNA. Initial findings reveal genetic signatures of Staphylococcus aureus and Streptococcus pyogenes, two bacterial culprits notorious for abscess formation and systemic infections. Moreover, chemical analysis detected residual arsenic compounds embedded in the tissue matrix, corroborating historical accounts of heavy arsenical embalming to mask the ravages of decay. Beyond microbiology, the field of archaeomalacology, study of insect larvae in archaeological contexts, has uncovered startling evidence of at least 3 maggot species colonizing the king's final wounds. Larvae of Lucilia sericata, commonly known as the green bottle fly, Calliphora vicina, or the blue bottle fly, and Wolfatia magnifica, a flesh fly species, were identified in astonishing numbers. Some bone samples bore eggs and larval fragments numbering in the hundreds, attesting to an infestation on a scale as horrific as it was relentless. These scientific revelations have intersected with social research on crowd psychology, illustrating what scholars call a reverse propaganda effect. Among Philip's adversaries, particularly in the Protestant realms of England and the Netherlands, the grotesque details of his disintegration were wielded as moral retribution, a stark admonition that divine justice could manifest in the most visceral form. Philosophers of the day, and later Enlightenment thinkers, invoked Philip's fate to exemplify Hobbes's concept of the state of nature, where absolute power, left unchecked, leads inevitably to suffering and violence. In modern political science curricula, the case of Philip II often features in lectures on the perils of authoritarian hubris. Analysts point to his overweening pride in divine sanction and military might, while neglecting critical health warnings, an oversight that proved catastrophic within the very palace he erected to symbolize his reign. From the Roman Empire to the Spanish monarchy, the hubris effect remains a recurrent theme, reminding students that unchecked self-assurance can precipitate the downfall of even the mightiest regimes. Literature, too, has seized upon this dark historical episode. Authors like Robert Graves and Arturo Pérez Reverte have drawn inspiration from Philip's final days, seeking to probe the intersection of personal tragedy and imperial legacy. Notably, the Spanish novelist's short work, The King's Rot, published in the year 2005, reimagines the last 10 days of Philip's life through the eyes of a royal nurse. The novel's stark, introspective narrative lays bare the king's isolation and wavering faith, underscoring a verdict as universal as it is bitter no mortal, however consecrated by birth or office, is immune to the ravages of flesh. Today, when one hears the phrase memento mori in popular culture, thoughts may drift to a cracked skull or a wilting flower. Yet for many, the most searing image remains that of a once formidable monarch, curled in agony upon a marble bed, his skin sloughing away as insects feasted on his remains. That tableau of disintegration has become a potent allegory for the dissolution of power itself, prompting reflection on whether humanity possesses sufficient humility to reckon with its own fragility in the face of nature. In the 21st century, as medical science surges forward wielding antibiotics, genomic editing, and advanced prosthetics, the cautionary tale of Philip II rings ever more urgent. Diseases once thought vanquished can resurface. Parasites and antibiotic-resistant superbugs lurk in hospital wards, and the limits of even the most sophisticated therapies remain starkly apparent. Philip's ordeal serves as an eternal testament regardless of rank or renown. No individual can wholly escape the primal fear of death. And so, the silent corridors of Escorial still echo with lessons from a king's painful end. His skeletal remains, once a laboratory's object of study, now rest in peace alongside his forebears. Yet the story they tell of bacteria, maggots, and crushing pride endures as a bleak monument to the human condition. It reminds every visitor and scholar that power, for all its grandeur, is subject to the same merciless entropy that claims all flesh. In that somber truth lies the final legacy of Philip II, a ruler whose earthly might crumbled in the face of microscopic foes, reminding us that mortality is the great equalizer. As inescapable now as it was in the dawn of the modern age. In summary, the horrific death of Philip II transcends a mere historical footnote, evolving into a multifaceted symbol across medicine, politics, philosophy, and popular culture. From the medical perspective, his case stands as one of the earliest documented instances of septicemia arising from a confluence of chronic conditions: advanced gout, progressing into rheumatoid arthritis, undiagnosed diabetes, and chronic renal failure that together undermined his immune system. These comorbidities provided an ideal environment for Staphylococcus aureus to take hold within abscesses, which then deepened into pressure ulcers as a result of prolonged immobilization. When maggots and lice colonized these sores, the resulting necrosis underscored the limitations of early modern medicine. Treatments such as bloodletting, cupping, and topical arsenic or mercury, rather than healing, accelerated tissue breakdown and drained the king's remaining strength. Thus, Philip's final affliction serves as a poignant reminder of the urgent need for scientific research and advances in infection control lessons as vital today as they were 4 centuries ago. Politically, the death of Philip II is inextricably linked with the gradual decline of Spain's once unassailable empire. His son and heir, Philip III, lacked both his father's steely resolve and administrative acumen, ushering in an era of negligence that saw Spain's military and economic dominance slip away. Provinces in the Netherlands rose in revolt. The famed armada that had once terrorized England faded into memory, and colonial holdings in the New World fell prey to neglect and rebellion. Enlightenment thinkers such as Voltaire and Thomas Hobbes seized upon Philip's demise as the quintessential hubris effect, illustrating how unchecked pride and absolute authority reveal themselves as fatal flaws. In their works, Philip's fate becomes a cautionary tale. Even divinely ordained rulers must submit to legal constraints and the social contract if they wish to avoid self-inflicted ruin. Culturally and artistically, Philip's ignominious end injected fresh vigor into the memento mori theme, a vivid artistic and literary reminder of human mortality. Baroque still-life painters populated their canvases with decaying fruit, wilting bouquets, fractured timepieces, and skulls, each image a silent echo of a monarch's rotting flesh. Historical novels, documentaries, and video games have likewise depicted his corpse writhing with maggots and swarmed by flies, engendering an indelible public image of decay. In every medium, Escorial, the grand architectural statement of his power, becomes a ruthless arena, where the most elaborate monument to authority is itself subjugated by the unyielding laws of nature. In recent decades, archaeological and medical analyses have brought fresh clarity to Philip's tragic end. Studies of ancient DNA extracted from his skeletal remains have confirmed the presence of Staphylococcus aureus and Streptococcus pyogenes, validating centuries-old descriptions of his infections. Archaeomalacological surveys have identified larvae of greenbottle and flesh flies, documenting a maggot infestation of unprecedented scale. These findings not only corroborate historical narratives, but also enrich our understanding of disease progression in pre-antibiotic societies. Meanwhile, El Escorial has become a destination for dark heritage. Tourism visitors are drawn as much by the soaring vaults and sunlit courtyards as by the whispered legends of a king's final agony, creating a uniquely somber spiritual pilgrimage that fuses architectural awe with morbid fascination. Ultimately, the legacy of Philip II endures as an eternal caution. Absolute power cannot shield the body from mortality's decree. In an age when cutting-edge technology, gene therapy, and regenerative medicine compel us to imagine a future unbounded by biological limits, the Spaniard king's disintegration stands as a stark counterpoint. His story urges humility and responsibility in our stewardship of nature's laws, reminding us that no throne, no matter how glittering, can suspend the decay woven into the fabric of living tissue. This remains the most fundamental lesson across the centuries. Though we may stand upon gilded pedestals, each of us remains subject to the same fallible flesh, and the universal bell that tolls for all will never cease its echo. After the death of Philip II on the 13th of September in the year 1598, Europe entered what contemporaries would come to call the post-Philip era, marked by a mixture of chaos and veiled triumphalism. In Spain, the royal court and the Catholic Church scrambled to issue strict orders, controlling the flow of information, intent on preserving the monarchy's dignity. The printed news sheets and court circulars, painstakingly hand-duplicated, urged nobles and commoners alike to offer prayers for the departed king's soul, that it might find eternal rest in heaven. They cautioned against mentioning any of the grisly details, maggots burrowing beneath the skin or flies swarming the ulcers, and instead portrayed Philip as a martyr of Catholic faith, complete with illustrative woodcuts of anointing oils, solemn prayers, and his final communion. Meanwhile, in rival states such as England and the United Provinces, the propaganda wheels turned in the opposite direction. Broadsheets in English and Dutch depicted Philip's crown stained with blood, his flesh infested by maggots, visual allegories meant to signify that God himself had judged the persecutor of the Reformed faith. Pamphleteers and polemicists applauded his gruesome end as a public lesson demonstrating that power, however absolute, cannot defy the natural order of life and decay. These lurid accounts fed a collective sense of righteous vindication among Protestants, who viewed Philip's demise as divine retribution for his decades-long campaigns against their co-religionists. Yet even the most scathing critics had to acknowledge one indisputable fact. Philip II was an extraordinary figure in terms of architectural patronage and governmental achievement. Philip's integration of a herb garden, an early modern herbarium, showcases his interest in medicinal botany, a collection that continues to draw scholars of pharmacology and curious tourists alike. Politically, the post-Philip landscape shifted dramatically under the reign of his son, Philip III, ascending the throne in the wake of his father's ghastly passing. He lacked the fortitude and administrative rigor that had defined the elder king's rule, indulgent in luxury and overly reliant on court favorites. Philip III opened fissures within the state, allowing court intrigues to flourish and emboldening regional factions. Historians often point to the younger king's reluctance to personally engage with governance, a legacy perhaps of witnessing his father's horrific disintegration as a key factor in Spain's gradual imperial decline. The memory of a once mighty monarch, undone by mortality itself, cast a long shadow over the heir, who preferred spiritual retreats and ceremonial functions to the hard work of statecraft. In the realm of political philosophy, the Enlightenment thinkers appropriated Philip's fate as a powerful exemplar of human equality before death. Philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau referenced the king's downfall to illustrate that absolute authority must be checked by social agreements and the rule of law. Hobbes's conception of the social contract found reinforcement in the image of a sovereign who, though divinely sanctioned, succumbed to the same natural laws as any commoner. Locke and Rousseau, championing individual rights and popular consent, saw in Philip's demise a moral underpinning for constitutional limits on power. They argued that real sovereign legitimacy arises not from hereditary privilege or divine right, but from the collective will of the people, an idea born in no small part from the cautionary tale of a ruler consumed by his own flesh. Thus, the death of Philip II reverberated far beyond the walls of El Escorial. It shaped the contours of modern medicine by underscoring the need for antiseptics and advanced understanding of infection. It influenced political transitions by illustrating the dangers of unchecked authority and the necessity of constitutional safeguards. It permeated artistic and cultural expressions as the quintessential memento mori, inviting generations to meditate on the ephemeral nature of power and pride. And in the annals of European thought, it became a touchstone for arguments about human equality, governance by consent, and the inexorable bond between mortality and morality. Sleep now upon these reflections. Gentle reader, let the echo of ancient stone corridors and the memory of a once mighty king's final breaths carry you into that quiet realm where history and humankind converge at the threshold of vanishing flesh. In that hushed space, perhaps you too will hear the faint toll of a distant bell, a solemn reminder that we are all, inevitably, subject to the same final decree. In the 21st century medical landscape, the story of Philip II has transcended mere historical curiosity to become a form of clinical case study. At Madrid's University Hospital, infectious disease specialists recently recreated a model of the king's festering ulcers using three-dimensional tissue cultures. By inoculating these simulated lesions with Staphylococcus aureus and Streptococcus pyogenes, they tested a new generation of liposome-encapsulated antibiotics. Preliminary results suggest that these nanocarrier systems can penetrate biofilm barriers more effectively than traditional formulations, slowing bacterial growth and reducing necrotic spread to mimic the sweltering, humid conditions of an Escorial summer. The laboratory maintained incubation chambers at elevated temperature and humidity, demonstrating how such an environment intensifies enzymatic degradation of tissue and fosters rapid bacterial proliferation. These experiments not only shed light on the dynamics of 17th century gangrene, but also guide modern strategies for treating complex abscesses in immunocompromised patients. Beyond pharmacological innovation, archaeogeneticists have delved into the DNA of the maggots recovered from Escorial. By sequencing ancient insect remains, they traced genetic markers in the bacteria those larvae carried. Notably, they found no evidence of the MECA gene that confers methicillin resistance in modern Staphylococcus aureus, indicating that antibiotic-resistant strains emerged later in response to human-made drugs. However, the presence of early penicillin-binding protein variants suggests that 35 or so traditional antimicrobial compounds, plant extracts, mineral salts, and naturally occurring toxins had already exerted selective pressure on bacteria. These findings illuminate the deep evolutionary arms race between humans and microbes, revealing how pathogens gradually adapted to chemical assaults long before the era of synthetic antibiotics. In the academic sphere, universities across Europe now offer interdisciplinary seminars entitled History of Medicine and Infectious Disease. Using Philip II's case as a cornerstone, medical students study the stark contrast between 17th century treatments, bloodletting, cupping, and topical arsenic, and today's standards of sterile technique, surgical debridement, and targeted antimicrobial therapy. Anatomy professors lead practical workshops on wound care, demonstrating how maintaining a dry, oxygenated environment around pressure ulcers can drastically reduce bacterial load. Public health scholars highlight how Philip's neglect of hygiene and environmental controls parallels modern hospital-acquired infections when sanitation protocols are lax. In these courses, students learn that while medical knowledge has advanced by leaps and bounds, complacency or outdated practices can still lead to catastrophic outcomes much like those that befell a once mighty monarch. On the level of popular culture, video game designers have woven Philip's ordeal into the fabric of grand strategy titles. In Europa Universalis Quilong, players taking the role of Spain must contend not only with rival European powers, but also with unpredictable disease outbreaks and supply chain challenges across the empire. A simulated summer heatwave in Iberia can trigger modifiers that increase attrition and slow troop movements, reflecting the historical consequences of Escorial's oppressive climate. Similarly, in Civilization VI, choosing Spain as a civilization grants bonuses to overseas expansion, yet players must also invest in sanitation, infrastructure, and medical research to prevent citywide plagues. These mechanics encourage a holistic view of empire management, teaching gamers that neglecting public health and environmental factors can undermine even the grandest imperial ambitions. Beyond digital realms, board games and role-playing modules sometimes feature scenarios inspired by Philip's final days. In one popular historical board game, an optional event card describes a fetid royal bedchamber, forcing the Spanish player to lose settlers or levy extra maintenance on armies until an embalming protocol technology is researched. These playful abstractions underscore how disease can be as potent a foe as any military adversary. Meanwhile, tabletop role-playing groups have crafted narrative campaigns in which adventurers explore the haunted halls of Escorial, piecing together the tragic fate of a king consumed by rot. In these immersive experiences, maggots and flies become storytelling devices, reinforcing the grim atmosphere and reminding participants of mortality's inescapable pull. Even scientific conferences now occasionally feature sessions under the banner "When Kings Become Patients," where clinicians, historians, and ethicists debate the lessons of royal illness. Bioethicists question the early modern practice of bloodletting and the application of noxious chemicals, drawing parallels to contemporary debates over experimental treatments and medical consent. Epidemiologists reflect on the role of environmental control in disease prevention, citing Philip's sealed and airless chamber as a cautionary example, and geneticists discuss the evolution of antibiotic resistance, tracing it back through the lineage of bacterial adaptations first observed in contexts such as the Habsburg king's wounds. Thus, the saga of Philip II continues to ripple across multiple domains of 21st century thought and practice. His protracted suffering has informed laboratory research into advanced drug delivery systems and pathogen evolution, shaped medical education on the perils of outdated therapies, enriched strategy games with realistic disease mechanics, and inspired scholarly dialogue on the intersection of power and vulnerability. In every context, the restless hum of laboratory incubators, the flicker of digital map simulations, and the stolid hush of university lecture halls echo with a single lesson, no matter how towering one's authority: the fundamental laws of biology remain sovereign. And so, as modern science and culture grapple with global pandemics, antibiotic resistance, and the limits of human mastery over nature, they find in the mournful story of a 16th century monarch both warning and wisdom, whispered across the centuries in the gentle cadence of inevitability. And so, as we draw to a close, this sombre yet invaluable journey, the story of Philip II's death offers viewers many profound lessons. First and foremost, it stands as an uncompromising reminder of the limits of power and human ambition before the laws of life and death. Even as a monarch perched atop the pinnacle of fame, Philip II ultimately proved helpless before bacteria, maggots, and necrotic abscesses, those invisible foes no military banner could ever vanquish. Second, this video underscores the vital importance of scientific and medical advancement. Ancient treatments, bloodletting, cupping, and arsenic did not merely fail. They accelerated the process of decay. From this, we better understand why hygiene, sterilization, antibiotics, and modern technology are indispensable in patient care today. Third, from a socio-cultural perspective, Philip's ordeal evokes awareness of equality in the face of death memento mori and illustrates the impact of the hubris effect in politics. When Enlightenment philosophers cited the king's fate to prove that no absolute power is exempt from nature's laws, they also planted belief in the social contract, advocating for the control of authority by the rule of law and the will of the people. Fourth, the architectural legacy of Escorial and contemporary archaeological and clinical studies do more than revive a dark chapter of history. They demonstrate the interplay between past and present as scientists recreate ulcer models and analyze ancient bacterial DNA. They provide precious insights into disease progression over centuries and inspire the development of new generations of antibiotics. Finally, this story encourages each of us to live with humility and greater responsibility toward our own health, our communities, and the natural world. In the modern era, armed with advanced technology, gene therapy, and regenerative medicine, we must still honor our instinctive fear of death and the fragility of the human body. Thus, after watching this video, let us carry forward this truth, no matter how absolute the power we wield. It cannot shield the body from decay. Fame and glory will pass away, and the greatest value lies in living meaningfully. cherishing every moment and every breath we have in the here and now.